Hello and welcome to this episode of the Geoeconomic Agenda, a podcast from the Institute of Geoeconomics in Tokyo that investigates the connections between economics, politics, business, and society. I'm your host, Paul Nadeau, and I'm a visiting researcher here at the IOG. Today I'm sitting down with Dr. Abraham Newman. He's a professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and Government, and we're going to talk about weaponized interdependence under the Trump administration. Dr. Newman, Abe, thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, Paul. Great to be here.
So, I don't want to jump right into current events, but I will jump right into current events. We are sitting through a very relevant demonstration of what happens when a state is able to exploit an economic choke point, and I'm talking, of course, about the Strait of Hormuz closure, or whatever its status is right now. What does that situation, the ongoing situation in the Strait of Hormuz, tell us about economic choke points and how economic interdependence is able to be weaponized?
Sure. I mean, I think, in some ways, the Straits of Hormuz is a very old story. It's back up there with, blockades and, people use physical structures in order to put pressure on their adversaries. What, Henry and I in our work on weaponized interdependence, what we've argued is that those structures have been...
you mean Henry Farrell, your co-author of Underground Empire, correct?
That's right, Henry Farrell.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Is that the networks that we built for finance, for production, for communication, they recreate these types of positions in the global economy. Everybody thinks about, the internet is flat. Well, actually, these things are not flat. The financial structure, the way production happens, they're often very hierarchical, and they have these positions in them that create opportunities for states like the United States, China, Europe, to restrict flows through them. And so the Straits of Hormuz is like a physical instantiation of this old school thing that then has been recreated in virtual spaces. And the US and China and Europe have been using these to put pressure on their adversaries. And unfortunately, I think the use of these tools by the United States or China or Europe, it legitimates now something that was really seen as totally illegitimate, which is Iran's use of the Straits of Hormuz. I don't think they would have been able to do that if not for sanctions and export controls and basically the slow erosion of norms against doing this type of coercion.
So would you say in that case that the idea of a blockade is old, pulling a metaphorical chain across the choke point to block traffic, that's old. But would you say that what's new is the way that closure reverberates throughout the economy? I mean, I don't mean to be glib, but one of the, beyond, gasoline prices and prices in the convenience stores, one of the things that we notice here in Japan is that potato chip bags are now silver and black rather than dyed because naphtha is one of the products that goes into the coloration there. That's something, potato chip bags in Japan were something that would not have been impacted in old times. I guess the question is, if I could try to summarize it a little more succinctly, how does this old way of doing economic warfare reverberate in a world that's much more interconnected than it once was?
Yeah, so on the one hand, you have exactly what you touched upon, which is markets are interconnected. So if I restrict my trade on something, it's going to have widespread downstream consequences. But I do think that in some ways, the Straits of Hormuz example is really a past version of coercion. And I think it shouldn't cloud kind of the way the tools of coercion have been transformed by globalization. Because ultimately for Iran, they can limit access to oil, but they're also limiting their own ability to sell oil, which means they're not making money at the same time that everybody else isn't making money. And this is very similar to what China does when they say, if you recognize Tibet, then we're going to stop buying your salmon or something like that. Or Australia, if you say COVID started in China, we're going to stop buying your steel. These types of coercion are very old, and ultimately the buyer or the seller is harmed as well. Ultimately, China backs down with Australia because they need the raw inputs. The difference in weaponized interdependence and the kind of the work that Henry Farrell and I have been doing is to say the networks, finance, communication, production, they often externalize the coercion. So US companies are not the ones that are enforcing sanctions against Russia, for example. It's often European companies that enforce those, but the US has set the rules. And so because the network is global, it extends the reach of who has to comply. If Deutsche Bank wants access to the US dollar clearing system, they have to comply with US sanctions. And that means their behavior is being shaped, not just those of like US banks.
So in that sense, this is both a question of countries of, possible choke points, integrated networks proliferating, but also countries figuring out how to exploit these networks for coercive ends.
Yeah, and that's in the book that Henry and I wrote, which is called Underground Empire in English, but in Japanese it has its own title, which is more like Weaponized Interdependence. Countries, especially the United States, started to figure this out after 9/11. It was not something where it was like, oh, let's build these networks and trap people and then we'll spring them, and like it's all this nefarious plot. It was much more, after 9/11, the US was in a kind of a panic. These networks of globalization had been turned against it. The terrorists used aviation, the internet, and also financial networks to build their resources. And so then you had agencies across the United States kind of scrambling to figure out how would they respond. And the Treasury, the NSA, organizations that had not traditionally been the kind of center of these types of coercion started to see what we talk about in the book as like the maps of coercion, and then target their adversaries with them. And then happens is kind of like a fog of war. First, they're used against terrorists, then they're turned against North Korea and non-proliferation, Iran, and then ultimately Russia becomes the target. And most recently, you have the US using these tools against China and export controls. But it's a kind of what you thought was the ceiling, you would never go beyond this, quickly becomes the floor as actors kind of integrate these tools into their everyday operations.
How long did it take for other countries to sort of catch on to what was happening and decide, hey, this is something we could use for ourselves? Because, I agree, because I read your book, that, it began with the United States. But now it seems to be, weaponized interdependence and economic security. I mean, that's one of the big buzzwords you hear all the time. So what's sort of the intellectual history of this idea beyond the United States?
Sure. So, I mean, the Europeans, they, interestingly enough, they often, would say they don't do this. It's like, oh, this is just something China or the United States does. But actually in the Iran sanctions that the US under the Obama administration worked with Europe to impose on Iran in the original nuclear kind of deal, it was actually Europe that cut Iran out of the SWIFT system. There was a law, a directive that was passed. And so Europe has been using these tools. They just kind of, pretend they don't. But most recently with the Russia sanctions, the freezing of Russian central bank assets, that was Europe that did the vast majority of that. And I know if you ask actors in Beijing, they would never say Europe doesn't play this game. They understand that Europe has this potential. So on the one hand, I think Europe is kind of in the book, we kind of talk about it as the sleeping giant. It has all these capabilities, but it doesn't really want to recognize that. And then on the other hand, China has been, I would say, just, the loyal student. They're watching and learning and adapting and then integrating these tools. And the clearest example of that is in the area of their export control regime around rare earth metals in particular. So, nobody in Japan needs to know the history. In 2010, the first flexing of the rare earth metals issue. But at that point, it was a much more, like the Straits of Hormuz example, it was a more old school version of we're gonna block sales. But then when they see what the United States is doing, they learn that they can actually extraterritorialize this power. They create a parallel system to what the US has. The US has this entities list. It's like a list of things that it's not just that you can't sell to China, but nobody in the world can sell to China, that kind of a deal. And they copy that. And then in the most recent interaction around rare earth metals, they're not just saying, we're not going to export the metals. They're also saying, if you use Chinese tools in your processing of these metals, we're going to require a license. And so it then forces, let's say, maybe you created a mining processing in Korea or Malaysia, but if they're using Chinese machine tools, then all of a sudden they're, under the power of these restrictions. And so you quickly see how advances in what we would call like the intellectual property network externalize China's power in that domain. And that really, I think, was what Henry and I would, think of as like the proliferation of weaponized interdependence. It's not just that the US is doing this, but other actors are copying, learning, and then using these tools as well.
So to focus on the Trump administration, there's that famous line from the first Trump administration, weaponized interdependence, it's a beautiful thing. A, do you agree that it's a beautiful thing? And B, turning to the second Trump administration, beginning last year, how has their approach evolved? Is it more sophisticated, more blunt, more comprehensive, more aggressive? How do you evaluate it?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that is important to recognize is that this stuff was happening way before Henry and I came up with this term. And, in the book, we kind of detail it going back to 9/11. So it's not, we didn't invent this. But I do think what we did was we offered a name and a way to understand what was going on. And it does make it easier for actors to identify the tools of coercion. And also, our hope is to identify ways to prevent its overuse or prevent it from getting out of hand. I think we would say it's a powerful thing. It's a weapon, and it, like all weapons, we shouldn't glorify it. It's like at the beginning of the Oppenheimer moment where it's like, wow, this is pretty cool. But no, this is very dangerous. And globalization provides so many benefits to so many people. And so if we overuse this tool, we're going to undermine that thing, which we all, prosper because of. And so it's really important, I think, for us is to create the responsible use of these tools. We're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. The goal of our work is not to say we should never use these tools, but they should be done in a responsible manner. And that kind of goes, I think, to your last point of the question, which is, how is this administration different? For us, the biggest difference is that they are increasingly using these tools not for what I would think of as internationally legitimate objectives, counterterrorism, non-proliferation, sovereign encroachment. Those are what these tools have been used for. Increasingly, it's what I would call parochial objectives. If you don't take our deportees, Colombia, we're gonna sanction you. And that's, very, very similar to what China does in many domains, is use coercion for political and personalistic ends rather than internationally recognized ends.
And the parochial, the personalistic part, I think is really important because this is a particularly personalist administration. I think they would be the first to say that. And they seem to they don't seem to mind the fact that they're getting rich in office, which is not legal, but they don't seem to mind this. So you have a situation where you have, as you said, a very powerful weapon, but people who seem to be more interested in personalist goals, parochial goals, than national security goals. That's a problem, right?
I'm very concerned. I have this work with my co-author, Stacey Goddard, which we call neo-royalism, which is basically trying to think of what is the international order that is emerging post the end of the liberal international order. And basically we, suggest that we're seeing the rise of an order that is based on not national interests, but the interests of personalist leaders and their insider court, their elite insiders. And in that world, tools like weaponized interdependence are used not to protect the national interest, but in order to both materially and also in terms of status, enrich those insiders. And you see that over and over with the Trump administration, whether it's, tariff threats against Vietnam, and then Vietnam, fast tracks a license for a Trump hotel golf course, or there's different other forms of, export controls are relaxed against UAE. And then, there's a bunch of UAE investments in Trump crypto firms. So, yes, I think that we're seeing a very different structure in the international order emerging. And what I'm very worried about is that this isn't just pure corruption. This is basically a different logic of how international politics works. And so I think a lot of people kind of laugh it off like, oh, that's so funny or weird or uncomfortable. But in many historical periods, that was how the global economy functioned. It did not function in order to bring general prosperity and wealth. It functioned in order to grow the riches of those sovereigns and their insiders.
So that leads to two questions, I guess. If you pull back into the intellectual history that you were talking about, post 9/11 and monitoring terrorist finance networks and all that sort of stuff, if you apply the same pathway from back then to today, there's two things that I could see happening. One is that this, gets built in. This becomes a feature of American economic statecraft, where the focus, as you've been saying, is not international security. It's parochial, it's political. You end up with individual sanctions on people who aggravate the administration. I'm thinking about the sanctions against Francesca Albanese with the United Nations, or Brazilian Supreme Court Justice Alexandre de Moraes. That gets built in to, U.S. economic statecraft. But also there's the other side of that, which is everyone else starts to learn and take lessons. And so I guess the two-part question is, one, where does this go for the United States? Two, what lessons do you think everyone, and by everyone I mean all the other countries that are targeted or watching, what lessons do you think they're taking, and how are they going to adapt to this kind of world?
Yeah, I think it's quite troubling because you see actors, I think, basically acting in a very short-term way of trying to avoid, being the target of this coercion. And, whether that's the Japanese, the 500 billion investment fund, or there was a hot mic moment at the Gaza peace conference where the Indonesian president pulled Trump aside and said, I'd like a meeting with Eric. Trump goes to South Korea and they give him a golden crown. These are just, examples of what I would say actors kind of debasing themselves to the logic of this new system, rather than saying, what, we don't play by these rules. We're about trade. Our future relies on free trade. And so, we're going to have openness. If you don't want to play with us for now, go home and, we'll come back when we're all ready to play again. I have been watching a lot of World Cup soccer. And it is, it's a reminder that rules can be enforced, and people, when rules are broken, that there's a penalty and that people abide by those. And so I think there needs to be a little bit more of just re-socializing people to understand the stakes, that you're not gonna kind of beat this by just pretending it's going to go away. And I think that gets to the first part of your question, which is there are actors now in the United States that see that they can use these tools in these ways. And so there's always the kind of, is this just a Trump phenomena? But one of the big lessons of our book is that presidents, starting with George W. Bush, but then Barack Obama, Biden, and then Trump, they all continue to use these tools. This is not just a Trump phenomena. What is new in the Trump world is using them for these parochial ends. But now that you've seen that demonstrated, you can imagine, why wouldn't a Rubio or, some other actor think, well, this is a good way I can build my power base and maintain my power. So those that just wish this will go away, I think are going to lose their fight in the end.
First of all, I think there are a few World Cup fan bases who might quibble with the fact that the rules have been enforced, but we'll set that aside. I don't want to offend anyone or start any fights. But I do want to go back to something you said about how countries are responding to the Trump administration, because I agree. It has, maybe obsequious is a little bit too strong a word, but there's a certain playbook that seems to be shared that, to stay out of the crosshairs, you have to play nice. And, you can, as a country, can define whatever nice means to you, whether it's a gold crown or a new presidential jet or what have you. But the idea here is to play nice. That said, why do you think countries haven't been able to bring more leverage to bear to counter this pressure? Is it fear of retaliation? Is it fear that on their own, they're too weak to bring pressure to bear on the United States? Is this a problem of scale, a problem of will, a problem of something else? What do you think?
Well, I do think that there is the reality that many of these countries, it's not just an economic interaction, it's a security alliance problem. And so they're thinking not just about tariffs, but about will they be able to maintain their self-defense if they really break this relationship? And it kind of differs across the globe of who faces this to what degree. I think the thing that's interesting, though, is that even in that situation, you see countries like Canada willing to, they're more dependent on U.S. military cooperation than any country in the world. And of course, they face an existential threat because of their location. But they've been willing to say, no, we're not going to, we need to imagine this other world, a world about rules rather than a world about coercion. And I think similarly, Europe is in a very strong position to do the same thing. Of course, the NATO partnership is very important to them and very strong, but you can see from the interaction between Russia and Ukraine, Europe's military survival does not need F-35s and the NATO level of production. It needs, massive drone production and the ability to limit Russian incursions. And so I think everybody is still playing in the old international liberal order, this world that they, grew rich from. They don't want to accept that this new world is going to be a poorer world. People are going to have less free trade and they're going to have to do more to protect themselves. And so that's a hard sell for any politician to tell their populations. And so for them, it's a simpler bet to just say, well, let's just appease the guy and hope it goes away. But I think in the long term, they're not serving their voters because ultimately they need to prepare for this new world with or without Trump. The United States is not going to be the provider of all of these global public goods for the next 100 years like they were for the last 100 years.
So in your analysis, what do you think countries should do? And you've explained very well why they're not pushing back. But is there a playbook? Is there a strategy for reining or containing some of this behavior that we've been seeing?
I mean, I think that on the one hand, Mark Carney, he has offered a pretty persuasive set of first principles, of like, we're going to be about trade, about openness. We're going to look for partnerships, diversification. A lot of the coercion that we describe in the book is based on, monopoly-like positions that companies have in the global economy. And it's kind of basic economics. Even for economic reasons, you do not want to rely on those types of actors. So it doesn't mean you need to decouple completely from the global economy, but you should be thinking about diversification. The other thing is the idea that, you probably need to have your own self-defense capabilities. It doesn't mean that you don't have alliances or you don't work with other partners, but you have to have a basic level of capabilities that cover your existential needs. And then the third is really being much more innovative about how you're interacting with others in the world. And I think Japan is actually doing a great job of this right now. I think for a long time, Japan was not really willing to move ahead with third parties without the United States' blessing. But the United States is kind of absent right now. And you see Japan now moving ahead with very interesting cooperative agreements with many regional partners and building, like an alternative structure for it. It's not challenging the United States, but much more saying we're gonna, in addition to our relationship with the United States, have our own set of economic and security partnerships. I wish that Europe was a little bit bolder in this domain because I think they're less dependent on the United States security architecture than Japan, for example.
All right, so I want to wrap up with a couple big picture questions. One, and you alluded to this before, the benefits of free trade, the benefits of globalization, creating more prosperity than humanity's ever seen before. Does a world of weaponized interdependence mean that life is going to get more expensive, period? That what we're seeing now is not the exception, but the free and open liberal international order from 1949-ish to 2010-ish, 2012-ish, that was the exception. Is the world going to be more expensive because of all of this? Is prosperity going to be harder to find, harder to achieve?
So I think the heyday of globalization really starts after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and it's a moment where there's no rivalry. So I was in a conversation with a small European trading state, and they were like, well, how can we have fragmentation in the global? Well, for the whole Cold War, half the world was off limits for these countries. They were not trading with the world. They were just trading with the Western world. So it's not that we don't know how to do fragmentation. We do know how to do fragmentation. It would be costly. People would be less rich, but it doesn't mean that the world ends. So I think a lot of times people kind of have this doom like, well, if there is fragmentation, then everything stops. No, we'll still have plenty of companies and life will be fine, but it will be a poorer world. My doomsday scenario is that we move away from, let's say, kind of blocks or regional trade to really push us towards greater self-sufficiency that destroy the general benefits of globalization. You already see, I think, these moves in China where, they're indigenizing sectors that they don't really need to indigenize because they're concerned about these types of choke points. For me, it's the kind of the security, risky product sectors blur and people start not being able to identify what's a safe trade and what's a dangerous trade. And so I think the most important thing to maintain the benefits of globalization in an age of weaponized interdependence is both that businesses and governments work to identify kind of what I would think of as like the no-go spaces and then the green light spaces, and then be clear in these yellow areas, the mid areas, what their intentions are. It's as much about intentions as it is about the actual, everybody's focused about what's the next choke point. That actually doesn't matter. What matters is what are firms and governments' intentions around those products and sectors. And so there needs to be a much broader conversation where firms, I think, are very adamant about we shouldn't be doing this. It's like national security actors will always try to seek more advantage, more tools, more capabilities. But in the past, it's always about the companies saying, well, if you do that, you're going to destroy our business, which is your business. And unfortunately, right now, I think companies are also quite shy about speaking up, and that will then expand the domains of what I would think of as the red zones, and ultimately that could really deteriorate globalization more broadly.
Okay, so the final question, and I do want to end on something of a constructive, maybe, I hope it's a hopeful note, but we'll see. And this ties back to a question that a student asked when I was teaching earlier this week. Hello, AJ, if you're listening. And he asked he effectively asked if interdependence is the kind of thing that can only be weaponized. Can you use it to build a more peaceful system, a more peaceful order? And what I think of when you talk about that is one of the intentions of the original GATT system, whereby integrated economies would make everyone reliant on one another and reduce the incentives to go to war. Is that something that is still possible, that's still in play, to use interdependence to build a more peaceful system?
Well, I think interdependence, there are two sides to it. And so it does create these dependencies where people see cost to rupturing them. And so that builds the kind of the bicycle kind of theory. We're going to keep doing this because if we broke it, it would hurt us both. But at the same time, we know that interdependence creates vulnerability, and that's what got lost for many, for the past decade or two, is this idea that it also creates vulnerability. So I think in terms of the constructive path forward, it is not to become like an ingenue who's like, this is all great, and but also not to become a doomsayer that says that there's no benefit to this. Of course, it has these large benefits. I also think at the end of the book, Henry and we try to signal these coercive tools can be used to motivate the creation of public goods. So whether it's anti-corruption or for climate change, or there's many places where actors are using these tools, not just for parochial ends, but to achieve what we would think of as collectively legitimate ends. The problem is the legitimacy part, is that other actors have to see this as that they're part of this game. I always use the example of the EU deforestation directive. It is punishing actors who basically do non-sustainable foresting. It sounds great. It's like, we should help the forest. It helps the climate. We'll use coercion to get this done. But if you're in Indonesia, this is basically your livelihood is being destroyed by this. It seems much more like imperialism than, helping the planet. And so in the end, coercion is a stick. It has to go with carrots. You have to build a world that other people want to participate in. And so these tools can be used to push the ball towards a better world, but you cannot just rely on them on their own. You have to get people to agree that this is a good outcome. And then, like the World Cup, it's really, at least I think some of the rules of the World Cup are good. It's pushing people back into the right game of play rather than letting things get out of hand. And so I'm hopeful that these tools could be used for that purpose. But right now, I don't see they're just a tool. They need a vision. And I don't see that vision being put on offer by major actors in the world system. And that's, I think, whether it's Japan, Europe, Australia, is really important, not just to be hiding under a shell, but saying, this is the vision for a better world that we want, not just at home, but also globally and together.
Okay. That's a good note to end on. I think it, provides a possibly optimistic way forward. So with that, Dr. Abe Newman, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Paul. Great conversation.
This is the Geoeconomics Agenda with Paul Nadeau. Finally, there are lots of ways to measure economic health and inflation in particular. Central banks typically rely on a consumer price index that consists of a weighted average price of a market basket of common goods and services that consumers typically rely on, such as bread, milk, credit card fees, basic appliances, and so on. The thinking is that by tracking a weighted average of these prices over time, we can get a more concrete sense of the pressure on consumers. Some have come up with more novel alternatives to measuring inflation beyond the market basket. Maybe most famously, The Economist magazine has its Big Mac Index, which tracks the price of Big Macs across the world to measure how currency exchange rates influence affordability between different countries. PNC Wealth Management in the United States tracks the Christmas Price Index, measuring inflation by tracking the cost of the items listed in the song The 12 Days of Christmas. But recently, Deutsche Bank has been noted for its Oasis Index, named for the Manchester band, and which tracks the price of 5 beers and 2 packs of cigarettes across the world. Likely taken either from the Oasis song Cigarettes and Alcohol or What Makes Up a Typical Breakfast for the Gallagher Brothers, the index tracks the price of cigarettes and beer and incorporates the role of sin taxes in affordability. Melbourne, Australia, is the most expensive in the world in this regard. Deutsche Bank also has the Cheap Date Index, which naturally measures the cost of a cheap date across world cities and covers the cost of a meal for 2, alcohol, coffees, taxi, and clothes. It shows that you can't blame affordability for Japan's low birth rate, since you can afford 2 dates in Tokyo for the price of 1 in London. But with my summer classes finally over, I'll be going for the cigarettes and beer myself, which themselves are among the most affordable in the developed world. That's all for this episode, but stay tuned for more on the way. Until then, we want to talk about what you want to hear about, as well as take your questions for our show, so send us an email at geoeconomicagenda@ihj.global. Be sure to like, rate, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, tell your friends, and most of all, keep listening. Thanks for joining us. Thanks to the team at IOG for making this happening, and we'll talk to you next time.